Thank you so much for taking me like the last few years of learning about racism and anti-racism to get to my current understanding of race, which is completely different to the view of race that I grew up with. So I'm first going to be going through some definitions and then thinking about how racism was created and how it developed into the 21st century, and then thinking about what has allowed racism to persist until now. To start with the definitions, prejudice. So prejudice is a prejudgment about a person based on the social group that that person belongs to. It can be based on thoughts, feelings, and stereotypes, and all humans have this. It's unavoidable. Discrimination are actions based on those prejudices. Races are groups of people which are not scientifically different from each other or biologically different, but are socially constructed based on physical features such as skin, colour, and hair texture. Racism is a racial group's collective prejudice backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, often enforced by a powerful collection of policies which create racist impacts. This is not the definition of racism that is in the dictionary or that we usually use, and we'll go more into that later. Therefore, an anti-racist is someone who expressed the idea that all racial groups are equal and supports policy that reduces racial inequity. And white supremacy is the racist ideology that is based on the belief that all white people are superior and should be dominant over other races. I also want to think about the terms I'm using to describe people who are not white. So none of the current descriptors are perfect. One term that we use is BAME, B-A-M-E, stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. Another is POC, standing for people of colour, or BIPOC, standing for Black, Indigenous and People of Colour, which is a more useful term in America, Norway or Australia, where they have an Indigenous population of colour. One of the main issues with these terms is that they assume that same people have the same issues, and it can hide a problem that one group faces. For example, a company could report that 40% of their employees are from a same background, but in reality they could have 0 Black colleagues and have an anti-Black culture at their organisation. In reality, these are the global minority. White people are these are the global majority, sorry. White people are the minority, which is another way, global majority is another way to describe them. And all of these definitions center whiteness. So it defines people by what they're not, and groups everyone who is not white into one group. So I'm acknowledging that none of these are perfect, but I will be mainly using people of colour or whichever term is used in the research that I'm citing. So thinking about how racism developed until the 21st century. Racism can be, racist ideas can be fit into 2 categories. The first is segregationist and the second is assimilationist. A segregationist believes that the racist idea that some racial groups are permanently inferior and can never be developed. They support policy that segregates the racial group, whether through slavery, segregation, or through deportation and incarceration. An assimilationist believes the racist idea that a racial group is culturally or behaviourally inferior to another racial group. They support programs which develop the behaviour or culture to be more like the dominant culture and believe that these will make the racial groups equal. They believe that they can become more like white people and therefore fully human. Like missionaries, they aim to develop and civilize people of colour so they can assimilate into whiteness. The difference between this view and that of an anti-racist is an anti-racist knows that the racial groups are already equal and none need developing. Instead, they support policies which reduce racial inequity. If you take the example of black men having a higher unemployment rate than white men in the UK, a segregationist will believe the racist idea that this is because they are less intelligent or less hardworking than white people. The assimilationist will believe that the black men are lacking in discipline and don't have the right attitude for work, and so support programs which teach these behaviours in order to develop black men so they can be hired. However, an anti-racist will look for the racist policies and structures which have created this inequity. They may find that applying to a job with a black-sounding name means that they are less likely to get called for interview compared to someone with a white-sounding name with the same qualifications, as found by researchers in 2009. They will then support anti-racist policies which reduce these racial inequities and remove barriers for people of colour. So I'm going to go through now the history of racism, looking at it as it turns from biological racism to cultural racism. A biological racist is someone who expresses the racist idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology and that these create a hierarchy. This idea, which informs many biases and stereotypes today, stemmed from the beginning of slavery. Some of its origins come from the 9th chapter of Genesis in the Bible with the story of Ham, whose descendants were cursed by Noah to be servants to the descendants of his brothers. This was taken as an explanation for black people's skin colour, as was written by English travel writer George Best in 1578. This also provided a justification of slavery, not coincidentally. It's because of this that Coates describes race as the child of racism, not the father. When traders saw black people as an opportunity to exploit them and make money out of them, they had to create the idea of race and racial hierarchy. Scientists carry out experiments which asked how is the Negro inferior, either culturally deficient, less intelligent, or less evolved to the white man, which will later be criticised due to it being unscientific, due to the obviously biased question that the research starts with. Now it has been proven that there is no meaningful difference between racial groups, but race was socially constructed to have meaning. People who previously identified as Catholic or Protestant, Welsh or Cornish were white people, and people who identified as Dahomey or Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa were now black people. Many influential scientists from the 1650s until the civil rights movement published pseudo-scientific theories in the many ways that whites were supposedly superior to other races, which politicians used to justify slavery, then segregation and colonialism. After Columbus discovered Native Americans, who were not mentioned in the Bible, there was some debate around polygenesis, that all men did not descend from Adam and they were therefore not God's children, which also was used to justify slavery. In 1859, Charles Darwin refuted the theory that each species was created independently and instead put forward his theory of natural selection. This was then in turn used as more scientific racism to justify a hierarchy of the races, but this time due to some races being less evolved than others. Whilst the US benefited from this narrative as a justification for segregation, the UK benefited financially by using it as a justification for colonialism. If whites are the superior race, then it's justified to take over the land of other races, enact forced labour, steal resources from their land. The reaction to the Nazi Holocaust made biological racism seem too extreme for most people. They could have become biological anti-racists at this point, someone who expresses the idea that races are meaningfully the same in their biology and that these differences create, and that there is no hierarchy of value. But instead, they turn to cultural racism. This is not to say that biological racism has gone away, and it still feeds into prejudices, stereotypes, and unconscious bias today. A cultural racist is someone who creates a cultural standard and imposes a cultural hierarchy among racial groups. They believe that people of colour are culturally deficient, and this is provided as the reason for racial inequalities. Whereas a cultural anti-racist is someone who rejects cultural standards and equalising cultural differences between racial groups. They deny that any culture is inferior to another culture. Cultural racists believe that Black people in Africa were biologically the same as white people, but were culturally deficient. So they could be taught British culture, and this would make them civilised. Another moment in history, though, made it undesirable to be seen as a cultural racist. The civil rights movement in the US allowed people across the globe to see the televised brutality towards Black people demanding their civil rights. People did not want to be associated with the people attacking peaceful protesters in the street, and they moved away from any open admissions of cultural racism. Like biological racism, though, cultural racism still informs many of our biases today. Since then, it has been more and more undesirable to be openly racist, apart from a minority of openly racist neo-Nazis who definitely exist but do not create the largest daily pain for people of colour. The vast majority of white people will proudly claim to be not racist. If you suggest that something they did was racist, they would likely be offended and put out claims such as, I have a Black friend, my parents taught me everyone was equal, or the epitome of 21st century racism, I don't see colour. '21st century racism is colourblind racism. Colourblind racism is perpetuated in phrases such as, I don't care if you're Black, green or white, I don't see you as Black, and I don't see colour. It stems from the phrase in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech that stated that he wanted to live in a society where people are judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. This was jumped upon as a solution to the problem of racism. Pretend that you don't see race and the racism disappears. Most white people believe that talking about race or pointing out someone's race is rude and it is what creates racism. However, if the majority of people do not see race, then how does racism still exist? Colour blindness relies on the concept that race-based differences don't matter and ignores the realities of systemic racism. If you do not see colour, then how will you see that your company systematically rejects qualified people of colour and only hires white people, for example? Colourblind racism seems well-meaning, but actually works very effectively to absolve white people from their complicity in upholding white supremacy. If you believe that you are colourblind, then you believe that you are not racist. If someone gives you feedback on a racist thing you have done, you cannot take on that feedback, as you don't see race. If you are, it also works as a gaslighting technique. Gaslighting, the term used to describe from the film called Gaslight, in which a man slowly turns down the light in his house and convinces his wife that he's not doing anything. It's a term to describe denying someone's reality and making them think that they are actually insane rather than perceiving what they are perceiving. So it gaslights people of colour on a mass level to believe that what they're experiencing is not the reality. It also denies people of colour their identity. When you say, I do not see colour, you're saying, I do not see you for who you are. People of colour have never asked to not be seen as their race, but have asked to not be discriminated against because of their race. Finally, it allows white people to not think about themselves in racial terms as white, but rather to continue to think of themselves as just people who are not complicit in white supremacy. Colourblind racists put more emphasis on not speaking about race than they do in doing something about racism. Colourblind racists carry out daily acts of racism called microaggressions. These are small, covert acts of racism that people of colour have to deal with on a daily basis. Some examples are asking someone, Where are you from originally? Or where are you really from? Or can I touch your hair? Or wow, you have such good English. Or you're so articulate. It is mistaking someone for the help. It is being surprised when a person of colour is the CEO. It's ignoring or talking over a person of colour. It's grabbing your handbag when a black man walks past. It's mistaking a black person for another black person. It's not giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's calling the police for just standing in Starbucks. These are some examples of microaggressions. As a single comment, they may seem annoying, but maybe not horrendous. But these are constantly repeated day after day. In the UK, ethnic minorities are 3 times as likely to be thrown out or denied entrance to a restaurant, bar or club in the last 5 years. According to a Guardian survey, 38% of people from ethnic minorities said that they have been wrongly suspected of shoplifting in the last 5 years, compared with 14% of white people. I know because my husband's black that every single time since he arrived in the UK 2.5 years ago, he's been followed around every shop that he has entered in the shopping centre, unless he's with me. They're twice as likely as white people to be mistaken for staff in a restaurant or bar or shop, twice as likely to have encountered abuse or rudeness from a stranger in the last week, and 53% of people from a minority background believe they've been treated differently because of their hair, clothes or appearance. These things are not benign. In fact, Ibram Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, disputes the term microaggressions and prefers to call them abuse. This more accurately describes the impact of these words on the people they're directed at: distress, anger, hurt, worry, depression, anxiety, pain, and fatigue. These are acts of daily abuse. They seem small, but actually convey to people of colour that they are inferior and do not belong. These are the ways that this is the way that colourblind racism is enacted on a personal one-to-one basis. And this overall has an impact on people of colour. But the major way that racism hinders people of colour is structural, systemic, or institutional racism. This occurs when a group of people with the same conscious and unconscious bias join together in an organisation and act accordingly to their biases. We can look at the structure of racism by taking an example of a black boy starting school in the UK. I'm using a black boy because there's a lack of research about black girls. Black schoolboys are 3 times more likely to be excluded compared to the whole school population. But if he does make it through school, when he gets to his SATs, research shows that he'll be systematically marked down by his own teachers, although this will be remedied if an independent examiner marks his anonymous test. When he passes secondary school and gets to university, he will be less likely to be accepted to a Russell Group university. At university, data from 2016 shows that 70% of his lecturers will be white men. He will not be represented in the teaching staff. When he gets his degree, he is more likely to get the lowest ranking degree. When he graduates, even if he did get the top degree, he'll be less likely to be called to interviews than people with the same degree and a white British sounding name. In his personal life, he will probably have had some contact with the police. Between 2017 and 2018, black people in Britain were around 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than white people. He'll be more than twice as likely to be charged with drug possession, despite a lower rate of drug use in the black community than the white community. In the process, he will be 5 times more likely to receive a harsher police response. Because of over-policing, he will likely have his DNA on the National DNA database, as 30% of black men did in 2009 compared to 10% of white men. When he has a child, his wife will be 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. A 2016 study showed that black patients were 20% less likely to receive pain medication, which is likely due to the myth that black people feel less pain. When coronavirus hits, people like him in the Black community will be overrepresented in those who are critically ill at a rate of double the local population. These are just some of the many statistics of how the Black man's life will be affected by systematic racism in the UK. Of course, I'm only taking one gendered racial group, and this is different for all the different racial groups. I just don't have time to be going into all of them. So this is the way that racism manifests in the 21st century. What has allowed racism to persist until now? To think about this, I often consider the question, how was I a full-grown woman before I even knew that racism was an issue in the UK? First of all, we have a simplistic and outdated definition of racism. The misdefinition that racism is single, covert acts committed by bad people means that we are unable to address racism as it manifests today. Understanding that racism is based mainly on unconscious bias means that we can understand how it affects our microaggressions and how it affects our systematic racism. Unconscious bias is the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people attribute to another person or group that affect how they understand and engage with a person or group. So if we take the definition that racism is having the unconscious prejudice plus the power to enact this over other people, then it allows us to see racism for what it is today. The misdefinition of racism means that white people are unable to discuss race because of something called white fragility, which I will explain after I've explained the good-bad binary, which underpins white fragility. So the good-bad binary is the idea that good people are not racist and racists are bad people. It's very dangerous and it underpins our inability to look at our own racism. It's based on the false definition. The myth is that only people who consciously dislike and discriminate against others hold any racial prejudice. We are socialized to believe that racism is individual acts that once committed would make that person a racist. When we hear the word racist, it makes us think of Nazi saluting, consciously white supremacist, people who are evil and go around saying the N-word. And we are socialized to know that it is bad, being racist is bad, so racists are deemed as bad people. Because of this, we never want to use the word racist. For example, when Boris Johnson calls Black people pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, or says it's absolutely ridiculous that people should choose to go around looking at letterboxes, the majority of the media will call these racially charged or say they have racial undertones, when in fact they are outright racist statements. When Uncle Bob at the dinner table says that Black people have a lower IQ than white people, his family and friends will likely not want to label this as racist, perhaps using claims that he didn't mean it like that, or he's a good guy, or he's friends with his Black neighbour. This shows that the definition of racism we are using is one of conscious dislike. It assumes that a person with racist beliefs cannot interact with people of colour at all, whereas in fact it's completely possible for you to work well with people of colour and still hold racial prejudice. In fact, you can be a good person, kind, generous to your friends and family, be nice to Black people and polite to them and still hold racist ideas. All white people do. If you are a white person, then you will have thought, said, or done something in the past that was racist. Of course, there are some people who are consciously racist, but most racism is covert. The reality is that all people have prejudice, and this comes out in our conscious and unconscious bias and in discrimination. There are no good white people. There are only anti-racist white people and racist white people. When we think we are one of the good people and not racist, then we do not do the necessary work to be anti-racist and will end up contributing to racial oppression. A way of looking at this that was helpful to me was to think of the word racist as an adjective and not a noun. What you said was racist, or what you did was racist, and you need to improve on that, but that doesn't mean that you are a racist who consciously believes in white supremacy. One moment you can do something that is racist, and the next you can do something that is anti-racist. Because of the above binary, when someone tries to give us feedback on our racist words or actions, we feel like they are accusing us of being a terrible person, a bad person. We then reply with defensiveness, anger, outrage, upset, and tears. We feel that our entire self has been called into question, and so all of our attention goes into defending ourselves and our morality. Despite this being termed as fragility, this is actually very powerful. The person who is pointing out our racism feels that they must then drop the situation. They are made to feel or perceived as others as the bad person in the situation. The attention is brought back to the accused white person, and everyone, including the person of colour who has been hurt by a racist act, feels the need to comfort them. The racism is never addressed. It discourages anyone from bringing it up again, and the racial status quo is maintained. Okay. So this means that we have a very low racial tolerance. We've hardly ever spoken about race in our lives compared to people of colour who have had to speak about it since when they were children. So a very small amount of racial stress, such as suggesting our experience is not the universal one, triggers white fragility. This results in the inability of white people to discuss race. We are completely illiterate in racism. Something else that feeds into white fragility is white exceptionalism. The idea that you are different from other white people that they are discussing, that you have had this life experience, are friends with this person of colour, that you are one of the good ones. We can always think of something that makes us exceptional and absolves us from taking responsibility. Therefore, we never fully engage in racism, and this is another way that it perpetuates. Another reason that racism has continued today is white privilege. White privilege is not having barriers placed in front of you because of your race. In fact, you've never had to think about race. It does not mean that you have not gone through different struggles, but it means that you have never had to struggle because of your race. White privilege is the privilege of going through life without being judged based on a racial group. You never have to experience racism or systematic racism. You are seen as an individual rather than a representative of a whole group. This is not to say you've had an easy life. Again, it does not say that you have not been discriminated against because of your gender, beliefs, class, sexual orientation, anything you've struggled with. It just means that you have not struggled with your race. Some of the ways I have noticed my white privilege are, I can switch on the TV and see people who look like me. All of the teachers that I've had until university, until my master's actually, and most of the doctors and nurses I had looked like me. The girls and women in movies looked like me. I could go into any shop and buy a plaster or makeup that blends into my skin. I can find shampoo that works for my hair. Everyone can pronounce my name. I can be late to a meeting without having that lateness reflect on my race. I can drive a nice car without being pulled over. I can walk around a shop without being followed by a security guard. I can go up to a police officer or anyone in an authority position and presume they will help me and not think badly of me. I have the benefit of the doubt. If I had a bad experience, I don't have to worry about whether it was bad luck or whether it was because of racial discrimination. I can look at my board of directors of my charities, of the charity I work in, and the trustees and see that they look like me. I can open newspapers, magazines, and most of the articles will be written by people who look like me. White privilege makes us so blind to the racism that happens around us every day. When we can't see the barriers in the way, then we subconsciously believe that people of colour are struggling for reasons of their own inadequacy rather than because of the barriers placed around them. The birdcage metaphor helps us to understand that. When you're up close to a birdcage, you cannot see the wires, so if you're very, very close to it. And we may assume that the bird likes it in the cage or wants to be in the cage. When you turn your head to the side, you can see one of the wires. Maybe this represents police brutality, which is easiest for us to see because of the Black Lives Movement at the moment. This is a barrier, but not too much for the bird to get around if it wanted to. But the more you step back and learn more and more, you can see that all of the wires interlock with each other to hold the bird firmly in place. They were designed, you can see that they were designed to keep the bird there. Another aspect that allows racism to continue is an erasure of history, the not telling our history as it was. So one place that I start is the World Wars, because I was taught a lot about the World Wars in school, but these are some facts that I learned recently, which really shocked me that I didn't know. For example, 30 million Indians fought for Britain in World War II, 74,000 of which lost their lives. They were promised to be free from the British colonial rule if they fought, but Britain did not keep their promise after the war ended. 16,500 West Indians fought for Britain in World War II. Hundreds of West Indian, African and Indian soldiers suffered frostbite and died from exposure on the boat journey to the UK because they were not provided with adequate clothing for the freezing journey. African men were forcibly recruited into the army for the World Wars. If they died, their families were often never informed. When they returned from battle, they found that they had been kicked off their land en masse so that white soldiers could be rewarded by the British government with a gift of land for them to live on, make a living off, and force the people who owned it previously to work the land for them. Over 1.3 million Africans and 2.5 Indians fought for Britain in World War II, but they were segregated, kept in worse conditions than the white prisoners of war. And while we were fighting for freedom and fighting in a racist regime in Germany, we were concurrently oppressing millions around the world in our own racist regimes. But I was not taught any of these. I've not heard them in any in school or at any remembrance service. Any pictures of the time did not show this. Only 11% of Britons surveyed that thought that Africans were involved in fighting in the world wars. Despite the support that Black soldiers gave the UK in World War II, they faced discrimination. No, sorry, that should be World War I. When they came back and settled in the UK after the war. In June 1919, there were reports of a Caribbean man being stabbed in the face by two white men over an argument about a cigarette in Liverpool. Fights broke out, police ransacked the homes of Black people, and a white crowd surrounded a Black seaman named Charles Wootton, threw him into the King's Dock and threw bricks at him until he drowned. Over the following week, white mobs on the streets of Liverpool attacked any Black person they saw. Instead of focusing on reprimanding the criminals, the British government started a repatriation drive, and by September of 1919, 600 Black people were sent back to where they came from, a stance which the government continues to return to this day. However, when we think about racism and lynchings and things like this, we think about America and we know very little about our history. Another part of history that I wouldn't know about if it wasn't for the Windrush scandal 2 years ago. The Windrush generation started with the first ship, Empire Windrush, which brought 492 people from the Caribbean to the UK in 1948. They were invited here by the British government to help rebuild the mother country. They were classed as British citizens, but in the 1970s, the UK decided that the colonies were no longer citizens. Some Jamaicans who lived the majority of their lives in the UK and had returned home to study or visit found that they were barred from returning back to the UK, where the majority of their family lived. This has caused many families to live split across the world to this day. And then we all know about the Windrush scandal that happened in 2018, where they were denied their legal rights and 83 were wrongly deported from the UK. Not only have I not heard of the struggles of people of colour, but I have not been taught about the successes of people of colour, such as Harold Moody, who started the first anti-racist organisation in the UK, the League of Coloured People, after he was barred from getting a job as a doctor after qualifying in the UK. In every area of the curriculum, I only learned about the white side of the story. I never learned about the history of people of colour. We did not learn about the Ethiopian monarchy, the Orthodox religion, the Rock-hewn churches, the Benin bronzes, the first university in the world in Timbuktu, or Mansu Musa, the Malian ruler who was the richest person to have ever lived. Nor did I learn about Black people's history in the UK. I did not know that Black people were Romans, and that the first person to have been proven to live in the UK was in 400 AD, and that this person was a wealthy person, not a slave, from the archaeological things that they were buried with, what that showed. I did not learn of the explorers who discovered Europe from South Africa. I did not learn that there were Black Tudors, Victorians, Georgians, and so many things that I'm not able to do justice to in the time. Slavery was the one thing that I was taught about. This was painted as an American issue, and Britain was painted as the hero who stopped it. I did not have one single lesson on colonialism and the atrocities that the British committed across the world. I was not taught about Stortford-born Cecil Rhodes, the white supremacist, who was one of the architects of the apartheid and responsible for the suffering of thousands of South Africans. The only time I learnt about a Black person was one Black History Month assembly, which was about Martin Luther King. I did not hear the name of a single Black Briton. It was as if they did not exist. I also did not see people of colour represented in my school community. I had one teacher who was non-white before master's level, and a master's I studied African studies, so there were some people of colour. The only time I saw Black people in my education setting was pictures of poor, starving Africans that we raised money for. And as Chimamanda Adichie argues in her TED Talk, the danger of a single story about a place of people is that we often have large misunderstandings if we only get one side of the story. Not only did we not learn the history, we did not learn that racism is part of today's society, or how to be anti-racist, how to be race literate. I believed until recently that there was no racism at my secondary school, until a group of Black alumni recently created an open letter, petition, action plan and testimonials of their experience at Herts and Essex. I'm ashamed to say I'm shocked by the racism that was perpetuated there by students and teachers, and shocked that I did not see it. Another example is a lack of education from parents. Black parents have to have many discussions with their children about race, about how to behave, how to speak in white settings, how to avoid being unfairly arrested or even killed by the police. Yet white parents do not speak to their children about these things. They do not have the talk about racism, as is common in Black households. In fact, they give the impression that speaking about race is a bad thing. Another way that racism is perpetuated is through stereotypes, which I think we all know. So whilst we claim not to be able to see race, we have a collective understanding of the stereotypes that have been built through the years of biological and cultural racism. If I showed you words of different, if I showed you words such as criminal, terrorist, you would know which group you would probably associate them to. This is because 90% of our media is controlled by people of colour. I did have all the statistics on my PowerPoint, but I've lost those ones. But the statistics, which I now don't have, but I will add to the paper, show that the media is controlled by white people and can portray, and they can't portray the true experience of the global majority if they've never experienced it and have few cross-racial relationships. One type of stereotype is anti-blackness. Stereotypes, our long history of racism feeds into anti-blackness, which is the name of a specific kind of racial prejudice directed towards Black people. And this comes not just from white people, but from other racial groups. Anti-Blackness is based on the alleged inferiority and primitivity of Africa, its people, and its nearer descendants, i.e. Black people. Black people continue to pay the highest penalties on pretty much every social measure or outcome imaginable within social structures. Anti-Blackness combined with misogyny against Black women has its own term, coined by Moya Bailey, misogynoir. Misogynoir manifests in stereotyping Black women as strong, sassy, and angry. They have real consequences for Black women. In the UK, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, as we've said before. Black British women are more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and obsessive compulsive disorders than white women, which is theorized as due to them not being able to express other emotions apart from being strong or angry. Despite this, therapists are less likely to perceive a Black woman as sad. Instead, they will see her as angry. Anti-Blackness against Black men upholds the colonial white supremacist view that Black men are lazy, unintelligent, and violent, and a threat to white women. This dehumanizing stereotype was created to justify the long, violent history against Black men, which goes from lynching to police brutality today. It manifests in Black men having consistently high rates of unemployment, getting harsher sentences, and in lockdown they're twice as likely to be given fines for breaching lockdown rules than white men in the same age groups. So, is there a way that we can be neutral about racism? Maybe we have not done something actively racist. Is there a way that we can be neutral, either racist or not racist? This is usually called white silence or white solidarity. This is when white people protect other people from feeling uncomfortable and from triggering white fragility by not discussing race or calling each other out on their racial biases. We often prioritize not making someone feel awkward over correcting a racist stereotype or comment. We want to keep our social status or not affect our chances of progression at work, or we don't want to be branded as the difficult one. It is seen as rude to bring up racism, and we want to be thought of as nice people, so we stay silent, thinking that we are not racist or being neutral by doing this. Being nice about racism, though, will not lead to progress. Racism relies on white people just being nice, continuing about their lives and just being nice. If you are nice to a person of colour, then you can deny that you are systematically oppressing them. If you're nice to white people who are being racist, then you can think of yourself as neutral. However, silence and inaction only allows the system of racism to continue. The truth is that white silence is violence. Every time racism is not interrupted, it is allowed to be perpetuated. Not interrupting it is just as bad as doing it yourself. This is one of the ways that racism has managed to continue. We often say that racism will die out with the young generation are more open, and it's just the older people who are perpetuating it, but still all of the stereotypes have carried down through all of the generations because of the desire to maintain white solidarity rather than interrupt racism. White apathy is passivity, and it's used as a mechanism to protect yourself from having to face your complicity in oppression and white supremacy. It's the feeling of, oh, that's really bad that it's happening, but it's not my problem. Or I would help, but I'm just too tired or busy or introverted to do this, or I'm not really sure what to do, so I won't help at the moment. Several factors can contribute to white apathy. White privilege, we don't want to lose this. White fragility, it's uncomfortable to do the work, so we don't. White silence, we're silenced because we're apathetic to racism, and the more you see it, it's easier to be silent, the more apathetic you become. White exceptionalism, that you're a good person and you don't need to do anything to be anti-racist. And colourblindness, that we are in a post-racial era, so nothing actually needs to be done. And anti-blackness and racial stereotypes. Subconsciously, you may believe that this is how these people should be treated, so there is nothing that you need to be doing about it. Another thing which has been researched is the lack of authentic cross-racial relationships. White people lack relationships across race. Working class white people often have more people of colour in their lives than the middle class white people, but these are often not retained if they are upwardly mobile and make it into the middle class. Many people of colour in friendships with white people are not able to be themselves because white people are so racially illiterate that they cannot share their truth about their lives with them. Robin DiAngelo says that if you have had a long-term friendship with a person of colour and they have never mentioned race to you, then it's not an authentic relationship. They have not been able to share their truth for some reason. Another reason racism has perpetuated is British ideals. So we believe strongly in the UK in meritocracy and individualism. We think that if you work hard, you'll get rewards equal to the amount of effort you put in. Racism challenges this because it says that different people do not have equal opportunities and will have to overcome many more barriers to get to the same place as others. We also believe in individualism, that we will make our own choices and do not see ourselves as a racial group. When someone suggests that we have prejudice or a white frame of reference, we think that this is not true because we are individuals. We deny that we have been socialized to think in a specific way. Ironically, proving that we have been socialized to think this way because we've been taught to think that prejudice and naming race is wrong. So we are denying it as we've been taught to. The idea that anti-racist actions are actually racist towards white people is called reverse racism, which is in quotes because it's not a real phenomenon. It depends on your definition of racism whether Black people can be racist. Robin DiAngelo and Layla Saad state that racism is prejudice plus power. For example, a Black estate agent could discriminate against me by refusing to show me a property based on my race. However, they do not have the power to create policies to stop white people from buying in a particular area by systematically blocking their loans, for example. However, Ibram Kendi denies that people of colour cannot be racist. He firstly states that a true anti-racist believes that all races are equal. Secondly, he dislikes the above definition because it denies the occasions when Black people do have power. It assumes that the 65 Black MPs that we have in this country now hold no power. There are Black people and other people of colour who hold anti-Black and racist ideas. He cites the example of Ken Blackwell, Ohio's Black Secretary of State, who successfully limited Black voters to access the ballot boxes in 2004. Black voters queued an average of 52 minutes to vote compared to 32 minutes for white voters. However, this definition may not be useful with white people who believe that anti-racist policies are actually racist ones. So the idea that any anti-racist action is actually racist against white people is one of the reasons that racism has been allowed to continue. But although Ibram Kendi thinks that racism can be perpetuated by people of colour when they hold power, he doesn't think that it can be perpetuated, reverse racism can happen to white people. Let's see how much time I've got. So where do we go from here? I'm very briefly going to touch on the ways that I see us making progress. And that is first by updating our definition of racism to what it actually entails today, as we've discussed the racism, the unconscious bias, creating prejudice and power, creating systematic racism. Secondly is for white people to have discussions about race in order to understand that all white people are racist and this is inescapable. This should be self-led and it should also be required in workplaces, in my opinion. This will increase our racial stress tolerance level, reduce white fragility, and allow for meaningful cross-racial dialogue. We will need to value social justice over niceness and our comfort level. Making mistakes, calling each other out, taking on board that feedback needs to be the norm. White people will then be able to build more authentic cross-racial relationships and build more compassion towards people of colour, which will reduce white apathy. People of colour need to be represented in every area of our society by removing racism in hiring processes and diverting resources equitably among racial groups. Our education and justice system would need to be overhauled to remove systematic racism. Anti-racism needs to be taught alongside our real history to children by their parents and also in schools. All of this would need to be an intersectional approach, which means that it would need to take into account the different struggles that overlap. For example, if you are a woman and a person of colour, you have different struggles to just a man and a person of colour, or if you're disabled or trans or gay or from a working class family, you have different struggles, which I have not had time to touch on fully today. So that is my talk, and thank you for listening. I've got some discussion question examples that we could discuss. Starting with, did anything make you uncomfortable? Have you enacted some of the ideas shared, such as white solidarity, acting on unconscious bias, or white fragility? Does the 12 Club think that they have been racist as a group? What could the government do to reduce racism in the UK? Are there things that you can do to reduce racism? Do you see the current Black Lives Matter movement creating meaningful change in the UK? Why do you think it has taken, why do you think the movement is taking off now? And yeah, thank you. I'm going to keep sharing my screen.